Hello and welcome to the Bow Skeptic Show on the Promethean Secular Frontier. How is everyone tonight? I hope you're all doing great because I'm doing great myself. We have a very, we have a very special show tonight. We have one of my favourite guests to have a conversation with joining us, Dr. Joshua Bowen, who is co-host of the Digital Hammurabi. Also has a PhD in Assyriology, and has some amazing books, which I think we have the links to all of those in the description. So please check those out. Also joining me tonight we have Jared, or Almost Atheist as he goes by, really good friend of mine, who has very kindly agreed to step in and co-host for tonight. And the topic for tonight is a failed prophecy, the Tyre prophecy from Ezekiel 26, which Josh has been really wanting to talk about, and it's one of his favourite subjects, so let's get into it. How are you both doing tonight? Well, thank you very much for coming on. So, do you want to start by telling us a little bit, firstly, just a little bit about yourself? I know you've been on the channel before, but just, for any new viewers, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and then go into a little bit about the Ezekiel 26 and what's piqued your interest with that.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me on, Katie and Jared. Again, good to meet you. Should be a lot of fun. I'm Joshua Bowen. I got my bachelor's degree from Liberty University in religion, and as a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, went to get my master's in theology from another evangelical school, Capital Bible Seminary, where I got the THM in Old Testament studies. And then I went to Johns Hopkins University, where I focused more on the broader ancient Near East, and I studied Akkadian and Sumerian, and focused more on Mesopotamia. Got a minor in Hebrew Bible, but while I was there, I became an atheist, agnostic. I don't know. I just after a while, I didn't care much which one it was. I had too much work to do, but yeah, so I wrote my dissertation on Sumerian literary and liturgical texts, which was super exciting, actually. And now Megan and I do, she's also an Assyriologist from Johns Hopkins, but we have the channel. Actually, she has the channel Digital Hammurabi. I'm sort of a periodic contributor now. But in my spare time, I like to write books. So actually, we just have another one that's getting published in 10 days. This guy, the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. This is the proof of it. This one I'm really excited about because it's got a chapter on the Ezekiel prophecy in it, amongst other things. So super excited about that. But yeah, so and feel free to obviously stop me whenever, because I may just ramble on. But the Ezekiel prophecy is an interesting one to me, because it's one that I would think that most fundamentalist Christians would sort of shy away from it. I would think that they would, as much as possible, kind of keep it in the closet. But they don't. It's ironic in that sense. It seems like it gets touted out quite a bit. Look at Ezekiel's prophecy against Tyre. And so to sort of, put it in context, Ezekiel, during the Babylonian exile, he has a bunch of visions and has a lot of prophecies. But one of the ones that there's a section in the book, chapters 26 to 32, or 25 to 32, I think, off the top of my head, are a section that are oracles against the nations. And basically, this is sort of a genre of text. It's a standard type of text where the prophet is sort of railing against all the nations, or many of the nations that are directly around Israel. and saying things like, "You've been really mean to us, and so God's going to come back and whip up on you." Right? That's essentially the message. Uh, in this particular section, you have this lengthy oracle of 3 chapters against the city of Tyre. And of course, Tyre was on the Phoenician coast. It's an island that's 6 or 7. It was originally 600 or 700 meters off of the coast itself. Of course, now if you Google it, which a lot of people do, you'll see like a big peninsula that runs out to it, and that's because when Alexander the Great made his causeway out to it, these deposits built up over time, so it's no longer an island strictly. But Ezekiel prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon at the time, who had just taken out Jerusalem, was going to march up and take out Tyre, and not just take it out. He was going to wipe out all the mainland cities to begin with, and then he was going to attack the island and take it, destroy it. And the language is, it's quite poetic, but
I've actually got it. Got the verses up on the NIV.
Okay.
If you want me to read any part of it.
Yeah. I think it maybe just kind of, if people can see it up on the screen. Oh, sorry, you're saying you're going to read it. It's pretty lengthy, but they're, going down, I think probably, I'm trying to pull it from memory, maybe down around verse 17, 18, 19, somewhere around there. It talks about how Tyre is going to be just scraped clean like a bare rock. And so it's, the point of it is that Nebuchadnezzar is going to come and he's going to annihilate Tyre. And it didn't happen, right? And this is a real problem. And it's not, it would be one thing if we had only, secular history to go on, extra biblical history to go on. I think, a good apologist might be able to, make the argument, well, they just got it wrong, or they're hiding the facts or something. The problem is that 3 chapters later, in chapter 29, which is 15 years after the original prophecy, Ezekiel says, Nebuchadnezzar worked really hard trying to take Tyre and didn't. And he uses the language, every head was rubbed bald and every shoulder was rubbed bare, probably from carrying those like siege baskets. But he had no wages for his efforts, right? He didn't get in. And so then God promises, Yahweh promises that he's going to give Nebuchadnezzar's army Egypt instead, so they can get paid, which of course also does not happen, but that's another discussion. But so the prophecy is one that the prophet himself acknowledges that it didn't happen the way he said it was going to.
That's a bit of a spanner in the works, isn't it?
Yeah, it's again. So when I think about this one, I think, all right, it would be one that I would expect apologists to deal with when it comes up, but I wouldn't expect them to come out with it, because it's a tough
not
one.
One that they put up there as like one of the main prophecies that came true.
Yeah.
Like for instance, both me and Almost Atheist were XJW, and it just for reference, I pulled up the jw.org website, typed in Tyre, and the first thing that came up was a passage which starts by saying, "The history of Tyre provides a striking example of the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. First the mainland city fell, then the island city was destroyed. Both events were foretold." So it's like the Lord, they're putting it up there on a pedestal as like one of the main examples of how God was able to prophesy things that came true, which from what you're saying isn't what we see from secular history, and even the prophet himself, it isn't what he acknowledged.
Yeah. And so that sort of the typical apologetic that you'll see. And before I go into this, I want to be clear that this is not a problematic prophecy for most of biblical scholarship, either in the sense that, or it's not a debated in that sense prophecy in even evangelical circles. Biblical scholars that are evangelicals recognize that Nebuchadnezzar was the one that was supposed to do it. Nebuchadnezzar didn't do it. That's not debated. Like this, is it Alexander that's in there or something? That's not really a thing. What and I go into this in the chapter in the book, but there are some sort of standard ways that scholars in the field have theological approaches to this. Probably the most prominent is put forth by people like Robert Chisholm and Chris Udd. But they make the argument that prophecy is inherently contingent. So, sort of the stereotypical example is Jonah with the city of Nineveh. So if you think about the way that story went, Jonah was supposed to go and prophesy against the city of Nineveh, which was exceedingly wicked, right? And he's 40 days and God's going to destroy you guys. And when he finally gets there, and the people hear that, they all repent, right? And they cry out to God for mercy. And of course, Jonah, if you guys have seen the VeggieTales movie, the VeggieTales version of that, he props up, to watch the fireworks, and nothing happens. And so that prophecy isn't problematic to them because the text is pretty explicit that God is saying, by the way that he responds, that the prophecy was sort of a threat that he would have followed through on had they not repented, but it was to try to get them to repent. And so based on that example, theologians sort of propose, well, maybe that's just the way the prophecy is in general. So it's made, it's set up to try to get the people to repent. And so then it's postulated that, well, Nebuchadnezzar, cut off the island city for 13 years. And finally, the king of Tyre repented to God. We don't really know that because it's not really in the text, but we can assume it may be. And that's why God spared them. So I don't think that's right, but that's not so outlandish, I guess, taking that sort of theological approach. Saying that Nebuchadnezzar isn't the person that's supposed to do it, or he's supposed to be just the first person to do it or something, that one is incredibly problematic. But that's sort of the thing. And the way that, the way that apologists come to this is they say, okay, in verse 3, you have this phrase, many nations. And so it says, many nations are going to come up against you, right, as the sea throws up its waves. And so we hear that in English, right? And we say, okay, all right. So that must mean that Nebuchadnezzar is nation number one. And then, other nations are going to come after him. So, like Nebuchadnezzar is the first wave to come in. And it doesn't mean that he's going to actually do it. It means that he's going to be like the first one to sort of chip away at it, which then allows Alexander the Great, or, even later people to come up against it to conquer it.
Of course, that couldn't be, that isn't the only interpretation of that you could take.
It's certainly not. It's certainly not the right one. So it can get a little complicated because it's there's some sort of Hebrew linguistic things to look at. But just reading through the passage itself, Nebuchadnezzar is specifically named as the person that's going to do it, right? As the leader of the nation of Babylon that's going to do it. And again, I go into the details in the book if people are interested in that sort of thing. Looking at how it is that you could the book is designed for, if you wanted to go into a debate with someone about the Ezekiel 26 prophecy and you wanted to be fully armed, that's what that chapter is written for. It's so that you read it, you've got all the data, you can take your notes, and you can say, okay, I can lay out systematically why it is that Nebuchadnezzar is the person that's supposed to do it. And the big argument that you hear from the apologists is that, well, it says many nations. And if you look at verse 12, leading up to verse 12, you have he will do this, he will do that, he will, he will. But then when it gets to verse 12, it switches to they. And they will do these things, and they will do these things. And so the argument is that, well, that shift in the pronoun from he to they is the shift in the referent from Nebuchadnezzar to Alexander the Great or the other nations that are to come. And there are lots of reasons that that's just not tenable. But the primary one, and again, it's a little complicated, but the primary one is the way that Ezekiel lays out these oracles, several of them. He has this way of talking about things and describing events that are to come that I give the example in the book that if I were to say to my kids, hey, this weekend we're gonna have a lot of fun. We're gonna go out to eat, and then we're gonna go visit some friends.
Mm-hmm.
That would be sort of a general overview of what's going to come about this weekend. But if my now 14-year-old said to me, Dad, I'm not really feeling that. That doesn't sound, I've got this other stuff. I could develop it more, and I could say, well, actually, what we're going to do is on Friday night we're going to go out and get pizza at your favorite pizza restaurant, and then we're going to go to this really cool bowling alley or something that you really like, and then we're going to go over to the Smith's house and we're going to have ice cream over there, and they've got this really cool movie that you want to see, and then you're going to spend the night over there. I'm saying the same events, but I'm developing them more, and I'm being far more specific about.
So it's all about the detail involved. In the description.
And that's what you see. If you read through Ezekiel 26, verses 3 to 6, I think it's 2 to 6, I think, you see sort of the overview, right? He says, many nations are going to come up, and they're going to, knock down your walls and tear down your towers, and they're going to scrape you clean and be a place to build, lay fish nets and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But then starting in verse 7, you can see it develop that in much greater detail.
Brings in the horses and the chariots with the horsemen and the great army.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that part where it says the many nations is developed then by Nebuchadnezzar, king of kings, horses, chariots, horsemen, great assembly, many people.
Yeah.
And that's not the only place that it's done, right? When it talks about knocking down the walls and the towers, it develops that, I think, for like a verse and a half. And I lay this stuff out so you can see it kind of clearly. The language is the same. The verbs and the nouns that are used are the same in both sections, but they're just developed in section 2. And this is a literary structure. This is the way that he lays it out. And this isn't the only place. In chapter 32, I think you have a similar structure. It's not quite as detailed, but it's laid out in the same way. You have these introductory verses that kind of give the general overview, and then it develops it in more detail. But the main point is that because one is a development of the other, and it's clearly a development in the 5 or 6 things that are talked about in the first section, they're developed in more detail in the second section. It's clear that one is a reflection of the other. It's just a greater description of the other. Yeah. It's not, this is talking about one, Nebuchadnezzar, and then this is talking about Nebuchadnezzar and, other people that aren't necessarily talked about in the passage. So if that made any sense,
that made perfect sense. And when you read it, it does come across like that. There is no when I read it, there was no change in who's actually doing this. It is in the reference of the same king, the Nebuchadnezzar. There's no change there.
And this is so to answer the two main objections then, why it is that it says many nations and why it is that you have a change in pronoun. The many nations is the Hebrew goyim rabim, which is like many. I mean, many nations is a fine translation of that, but the way that Nebuchadnezzar's army is described, and not just here in chapter 26, but in the book of Jeremiah, even in other parts of Ezekiel, it's described as being made up of many nations. So if you think about the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire conquered the Neo-Assyrian Empire in like 610.
Yeah. Well, that leads into one of the questions actually that I did have for you, which was within Nebuchadnezzar's army, within the Babylonian army, how was that army structured? What was the structure of the army?
And that's the question to ask, right? So, Ezekiel talks about how these different nations make up the Babylonian army, including the Assyrians, and the reason for that is that. And this was nothing new in the ancient world, but the Neo-Babylonian army had its own standing army, right? But when they went to war, or they went to campaign, one of the things that you do if you're a vassal is you supply troops. That's what you do, right? So when it talks about these nations that are coming up, the description that's in verse 7, I think, that talks about the King of Kings, horsemen, chariots, all these things, and a vast host. That language is descriptive of it quite often, particularly when it relates to an army, just this huge host of people, and they're made up of not only the standard Neo-Babylonian army, but also of the constituent parts of Babylonia. You had Chaldeans, you had Arameans, you had native Babylonians, but then you had these vassals that were to supply troops. And again, this is not novel. This isn't. This isn't like the only place that Nebuchadnezzar's army is described as consisting of many different nations. And again, I won't list them here, but. I kind of go into detail in the chapter, but so it's not a complicated issue. It's not really debated in scholarly circles. So I quote, I don't know, 5 or 6 different mainstream scholars, and again, it's just to those 6 I could have added 30 that say, what the many nations is talking about Nebuchadnezzar's army and how it's made up. So it's just pretty. Even though in English it makes sense, right, to read many nations, and we go, oh well, that Nebuchadnezzar's army, the Neo-Babylon, that's one nation, so that's just nation one. That makes sense in English. I get that, but it's not just a question of reading it in the English.
Of course, it was not wrote in English originally, so
this is true. Which then leads into the question that I then hear, which is, well, now wait, what about the shift in pronoun in verse 12? Well, I mean, if you just read it in English, it'll make sense, right? So he's talking about Nebuchadnezzar. There are 3 different agents that are talked about in the passage. Yahweh is the one. So he talks, I will do this, I will do that, I will bring these people, I will destroy you, whatever. Then it talks about Nebuchadnezzar in the third person, singular, like he will do this, he will do that. But then it switches to his soldiers, the ones that are actually doing it, right? This huge host of people that's coming in. And so when it talks about they will trample down your streets, right? They will destroy your houses. It's talking about the soldiers. It's not talking about some, mysterious later nations.
So then using he wouldn't have made sense. They've switched the angle of perspective. So
and that's exactly what it does. And what's interesting about this, and not that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, not that this is like definitive or anything, but the way that the Greek translators understood this, they didn't translate verse 12 with they. They kept it as a singular, he. So they continued on with the idea of Nebuchadnezzar doing it as the representative of the army, right? In the same way that, of course, we would say when President Bush invaded Iraq, right?
Yeah.
We're not talking. He wasn't in there with a M16, or he wasn't flying one of the airplanes or something, right? He's just the representative of the army because he's at the head of it. So, yeah, it's very clear, not only in chapter 26 itself, but it is very clear in chapter 26. But then, of course, you have him 3 chapters later looking back and saying,
I think I got this a bit wrong.
yeah. And that, the reason, of course, an apologist will come back to that and very clever responses. Actually, I've heard very clever responses, and I don't think they were, original to the people that gave them to me. But, well, it says that Nebuchadnezzar's army didn't get wages. Like they didn't get pay from it. So could it be, thinking very business-like, could it be that all their capital was spent getting into Tyre, right? So all the money that they had to spend, well, they finally got in, but they had spent so much more money than they anticipated. And so even when they got all the wealth from Tyre, which of course we know didn't happen from history, but set that aside, when they got all the wealth from Tyre, it still wasn't enough to cover all their expenses. So they didn't actually get any profit, right? It's very clever.
It is.
It doesn't work, but it's very clever. So we know from not only from previous history, there are at least 3 that I can think of. Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, so 4, Ashurbanipal. All those Neo-Assyrian kings came up against Tyre and tried to take Tyre. And they tried to take it sometimes initially in different ways, but what they all ultimately ended up doing is cutting off the mainland cities from the city of Tyre. So I guess I should probably talk about what that means. So directly opposite from the island were cities, different cities. There's Akko. There's the big one is Ushu, and Ushu was again directly opposite Tyre on the mainland. And we know from ancient administrative and royal inscriptions that Ushu was a source of supplies, food, wood, fresh water. They buried people there for the island city of Tyre. And so when you wanted to lay siege to the island, because it was out in the water, you could either try to get out there and actually break through the wall, or you could just set up a blockade along the shore
Try to stop
and cut off.
Yeah.
That's right. Cut off the mainland cities from them. And that's what kings did, right? We see that in their inscriptions. So they'll either completely take over Ushu, which is where there was a big spring there of fresh water. They would either take it over and cut it off, or they would just blockade it. And the problem, of course, with Tyre is that they had a really nice fleet, and so they could go. It would be a real hassle for them, but they could go elsewhere in their ships to try to get supplies. And they dug wells down in the island to let rainwater kind of collect, and they use that for water. But so there are siege tactics that you can survive on, which is how they did it. But that's what Nebuchadnezzar did, and the problem is that like we see this in history, we see what the Neo-Assyrian kings did, and they could take the mainland very easily. Ashurbanipal, for example, talks about how he was out campaigning somewhere else, And on his way back, he took the mainland city of Ushu, right? On his way back. So there's this other apologetic argument that says that that Nebuchadnezzar didn't lay siege to the island. What he did is he laid siege to the mainland city of Ushu. And he did that for 13 years, which is what we see in Josephus, that it took 13 years. And that at the end of the 13 years, he was finally able to break in to Ushu, only to find that the people had been escaping out of the back of Ushu to go to the island of Tyre.
Well, that seems like a very bad blockade.
Yes, right. It's a very strange one. For 13 years, you just stay on the far side of the city. I don't usually. So yeah, that's not a very popular argument, but it is one that is made. But again, the idea that Nebuchadnezzar, which was had a mightier force, certainly than that which I would ostensibly had a mightier force than what the Neo-Assyrian army did at that time, that Ashurbanipal could take it on his way back home, but Nebuchadnezzar couldn't take it for 13 years, seems to, stretch credulity quite a bit.
So we have a question up in the chat from Jim Majors. He's asking, does the explanation in Ezekiel 29:17 through 21 resolve any of the issues brought up in chapters 26 through 28?
So the way that prophecy is set up, kind of have to go back and think about Ezekiel. Ezekiel had problems with people believing him. So if you go back to like chapter 13, you can start to see some of these things where the people just, is he really a prophet? Is he really speaking for God? So if you can imagine already a guy that's sort of in that position, he gives this incredible prophecy, right? The Tyre is going to be scraped clean, which, by the way, the name Tyre means it's like a type of rock. So the name itself, it was, legend has it that it was built by Hiram the First, I think, on two rocks that were tied together anyway. But that's where the name comes from. So that making it a bare rock is sort of poetic. So Ezekiel says that this thing's going to be, it's going to be good for nothing but spreading out your fish nets to dry. That's the only thing it's going to be good for. This incredibly wealthy hub of, this hub of trade, this gem out in the sea is going to be nothing but just a big rock. And of course it doesn't happen. So now, Ezekiel's looking at this going, it's been 15 years. Ostensibly 2 years after the siege ended, right? And I think it's Ethobal III, the king of Tyre, sort of capitulates and pays some tribute to Nebuchadnezzar, and he goes home. Ezekiel's looking around, going, "Well, damn, what are we going to do here?" And surprise, surprise, he gets another vision, right, from the Lord. Oh, it's all good, guys. This is all part of God's plan, right? Because God wants to give him Egypt instead. That's the deal. So does it answer any of the questions? I mean, what I think it does is it solidifies that Nebuchadnezzar. Let me put it this way: if Alexander or some other later nation was in Ezekiel's prophecy of chapter 26, Ezekiel didn't know it.
Yeah.
Because there would be no reason whatsoever for the 29 prophecy, none. Ezekiel would say everything's right on schedule, right? That's wave number one.
That's a good point. Get
ready, Tyre, because it's going to get real. But no, it's a corrective type of prophecy. It's a type of explanation for why it is that things didn't pan out the way that they were supposed to. And again, just so that this is clear, I like to say this a lot. This is not some idea of mine, right? I'm not breaking any new ground here with what I'm writing or talking about. I'm doing is giving you consensus scholarship. This is what consensus scholarship is. This is all agreed upon. Everything that I've said it's not debated. This is not debated stuff. So
is this the only time, or is there any other occasions where we see this change in, where you've got the prophecy and then you've got the prophet amending it a few chapters later? Is this the only time we see this in the Old Testament?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head that is like this. And really, it's one of the things that lends credibility to its authenticity, because this would be the sort of thing that later redactors, you would think, would try to weed this out a little bit, right? Play with it a little bit to say, even if they put in there like, if you will but repent, if you don't, God's going to do this, then you sort of have an out. But no, I mean, I think the fact that this is standing in the text, 26 and 29 stands. It's odd. It's odd. I'm not saying that there isn't anything, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Yeah.
That looks like this.
Interesting. You would have thought that they would have left it there. They would have tried to, leave it out at some time, wouldn't you? And especially not like hold it up on a pedestal, sort of thing.
I guess we see something like this. It's not quite the same. And actually, Jim Majors, who asked that question, he wrote his dissertation on the book of Daniel, and so he could probably speak to this more than I could. But you see in Daniel, there's this prophecy of a period of time that's roughly 3.5 years. So you have this abomination of desolation. It's going to take place times, and half a time, or 3.5 years, or what is it, 1,260 days. And then you end up in chapter 12, and I'll probably forget the numbers, but it's like 1,290 days. And then immediately after, I think even in the same verse, it says 1,335 days. So I know that I remember John Collins talking about, when he wrote about this, talking about it's possible that this is sort of later, slightly later writings. So if we were to say, if I were trying to give, I don't know, let's say we went to war against, I don't know, nation X, and the boys were down in the trenches, right? And you're trying to rally the troops or whatever. And you say, all right, everybody, God's given me a prophecy, just 10 more days, just 10 more days. And God's going to come and deliver us. And then, 10 days comes, and I say, remember what God said, just 12 more days, right? And we're going to be out of here. And then finally it's 20 days that we actually get delivered, and then somebody makes an amendment to that prophecy, like and blessed is he who withstands the 20 days of trouble. So maybe that's what's going on there. But again, Jim Majors will be somebody to speak to them more. But that might be something similar, this later emendation to try to. But it's not to it is to correct it, I guess, sort of update it. But it's. Mm-hmm. This one's interesting because it seems to overtly say, oops.
Actually, we have another question from Jim Majors. He's asking, is the failed prophecy something we can use to determine a date of authorship for Ezekiel?
I think that it weighs in the category, in the authenticity category, dating it to the Babylonian exile, at least that section, those sections of it. Now, the dating of the book of Daniel's, I mean, of Ezekiel is certainly not, something that I've worked on in any serious way. So people should certainly refer to like Stephen Cook wrote the recent chapters 38 to 48, I think, of the Yale Anchor Bible Commentary series on the book of Ezekiel. So he's somebody that has been on our channel before, and maybe we can ask him to come back on and talk about that and what scholars think about the dating of Ezekiel. But I think that does play in. It's a question of are we looking at a later editor that's reworking it, or are we thinking this actually does go back to the prophet Ezekiel? And I tend to think that it goes back to Ezekiel, but again, it's not my area.
We also have another question from Jay. He's asking, from someone we both know, can you give an archaeologist that would say that Tyre still exists, even though the ancient city of Tyre was destroyed?
I mean, Tyre really wasn't destroyed. So certainly, if we think about the two major events that come up in this discussion, you have Nebuchadnezzar's siege, and then you have Alexander's siege, right? So Nebuchadnezzar destroys the mainland. To what extent? At least he takes it over. The prophecy says that he's going to ravage it, but at least he takes it over. It's certainly there later. So I suspect it's probably more that he just kills a bunch of people and causes it to submit and sets up his blockade.
Yeah.
But he doesn't get into Tyre, right? And that much I think we know. So then in 332, I guess, that's when Alexander comes up against Tyre. I think it's in 332. And yeah, it's there at the end of the 4th century when he's on his move. And what he does is dismantles the mainland cities and uses the stones to build, of the city and the rubble, to build his causeway. And it's a very complicated process that he goes through, and it's not my area of expertise. But he doesn't, when he finally does break into Tyre, he doesn't scrape it clean. Right? I don't even think he kills, if I remember, he doesn't actually depose the king that's on the throne. I think he leaves him in place. He does kill, I can't remember the number, but he certainly kills a lot of people and enslaves a bunch of them. But it's not like he pulls the walls down and destroys the city and, it's submerged in the ocean like that. That doesn't happen. So, again, the history of Tyre is not certainly past Alexander is not my specialization either. So I couldn't speak to that, but
I think he was asking it in jest, actually, because he's just put a comment in there. That's a question I think Jesus is Lord would ask of Dr. Josh about the city.
I suspect so. I mean, the thing that comes up, of course, in these debates, and this is the primary reason that I wrote this book, is that atheists and skeptics are right in most of the arguments that I hear between atheists and apologists. Not all, but most. Again, in my experience. But oftentimes, they will use examples or arguments that I think are just slightly off. And I think to myself, I probably wouldn't argue that. A good example of this, as we've talked about before, Katie, is in Exodus 21, 20 to 21, where it talks about if a man beats his male or female slave with a rod and they die immediately, then he's to be punished. But if he survives a day or they've survived a day or two, then he's not to be punished because there is property. And atheists and skeptics will often argue, see, this is a law it's like a manual on how to beat your slave to within an inch of their life and get away with it. And that's not really the intent of that law. The intent of the law is to protect the slave. Does it create a significant loophole? Yes. Does it inadvertently maybe create a manual? Yes. But that's not the intent of the law. It's not like the text is trying to go out of its way. And so one of the arguments sort of like that I hear is, well, look, you can Google tire right now, and there it is. And while that's true, I think that's true. I think that certainly Ezekiel 26, the way that it's describing, if we're reading it in that sense, the way that the text describes the destruction that's going to come upon Tyre, it's going to be a bare rock. That's it, right? It never again will it be built again. Never will it be built again. So I mean, in that
verses,
sense,
isn't it?
Yeah,
be songs sung about how how Tyre used to be, and it won't ever be the same again.
Yeah, and I mean, in a sense, it never was really the same place again. But again, that's a far cry from what the prophecy is calling for. So yeah, I mean, if you do Google and you see Tyre there, I do think that that's problematic for the prophecy, but it's probably not something that I would go to. I understand why you go to it. I'm not saying that that's necessarily wrong. You being the people in the skeptic community generally. But I think the key is to focus in with an apologist on who is this about? And let's look at the literary structure, and let's look at the language. Let's look at the Hebrew. Let's look at the fact that in these opening verses, you have these specific words that are used, and that those specific words show up in this more detailed section in section 2. It's clearly section A, section B, and they're mirroring one another. It's just this one's more developed in detail. So
that sort of leads me on to a question that I did have for you as well, and it's something that Jim Majors has actually mentioned in a comment, which is are all of the parts of Ezekiel in this in 26 Ezekiel 26, are they all written at the same time, or were some later additions?
That's a good question. One that I don't know the answer to, actually. I think what he's asking is, does section A get written?
Yeah,
and then section B get written later?
His comment was, because that was my question. His comment was, most date the majority of the book of Ezekiel to the time it proposes to be written, but scholars say that some parts of Ezekiel are later additions and are not original.
So the reason that I would think that it's a unity, that at least these sections in the Oracles Against the Nations, again, nobody should, we should ask Stephen Cook or Moshe Greenberg or some of these people that are Daniel Block. But the reason that I think that they're probably a unity is because of their literary structure. So you have this pattern that shows up not just in Ezekiel 26, but again in other, chapter 32. You have this pattern where it says there's a date formula, and then it says Son of Man, talking to Ezekiel, and then it says, Thus says the Lord, and then a paragraph, and then 4, Thus says the Lord, and then a longer paragraph, and those two paragraphs are connected. Those are the ones that are mirroring one another. And then section C starts again with Thus says the Lord, Yahweh. And then section B, the fourth one, again has 4, Thus says the Lord, Yahweh. And I have a chart in the book that it shows that clearly. So it won't be confusing when you look at it. But the literary aspect of this leads me to believe, if I had to bet, somebody held a gun to my head and said, "You have to answer." I would say that yeah, these are probably written at the same time. These
Hmm.
sections,
Okay. Yeah.
but I am
Um.
very happy to be wrong about that.
Yeah. So, Jared, did you have any questions? You've been quiet up until now. I think I've been hogging all the limelights.
No, I've just been captivated. I don't know that I have any questions off the top of my head. I just find it um, very impressive, just the depth of the information. And what you'd mentioned too about how sometimes you touched on an atheist or a skeptic's approach in a debate. And I think that's important because doing enough research. I mean, that depth that you were using comes from, I can imagine, a lot of time and energy put into these things, right?
A
And
little bit,
otherwise, if everything was just a Google search away, then, where's the fun in that? So
right?
to me, I just think I'd be lying if I said a couple of those arguments hadn't been ones that I might have grazed myself in the past. And so I think it just inspires me to continue getting deeper in that. I suppose I'll make a statement that's partly a question just to get your perspective on it. It seems to me that in order to be an apologist in this particular topic, you have to kind of trade, how do I say, any way you're going to position that argument to try to make it make sense, you're going to be missing another piece of information. So, for example, when you mentioned the idea that in 29 it's talking about not getting wages, but
Hmm.
yet in 26 it talks about how they're going to plunder all the resources. So, if you're going to make that argument that they, maybe it's the money, then won't you have to overlook the fact that in
Yeah.
26 it says resources? Any way you take it, it seems to be flawed. I guess the question for me that comes from that, how, and especially if this applies to people in your field who have access to the same tools that you have, but maybe come to a different conclusion, how do they do that?
Hmm.
and and maybe what would you say to people who don't have PhDs that still want to do that research? What caution would you give them in really honing in on those facts?
Yeah. So the people that come to different conclusions that are biblical scholars are coming to them. They're different theological conclusions. So one of the things that I think probably many people don't know, that are Christian apologists, is that for the most part, I think biblical scholars are all working with the same data points. Like we all know about that archaeological discovery and that find and this text. Like n- usually when you go give a paper or something and somebody says, if they're talking about the Exodus and they say the Merneptah still in 1207, there aren't people in the audience, biblical scholars in the audience going, the what? What is what is that? Oh my gosh, I didn't know about that. Like we all know about that, right? You have to, because it's just it's what you're working with. The difference is what interpretive model you use to tie all those data points together. And, of course, you see that in any detective show, right? Any detective, they're all working. There's a knife and there's blood and there's that DNA. Well, the defense knows about those 3 points. They just come up with a different story to explain them. One of the things that I see, particularly with Christian apologists, is that there are lots of data points that they just don't know about, and so they're coming to it, and they have a model, they have an interpretive model that deals with the data points that they do have, but then there are these sort of big ones that are like, yeah, but you didn't think about this one, and then it becomes a problem that they either have to shuffle or whatever, but. So with something like this in Ezekiel 26, biblical scholars again are not saying, "Oh, there's no problem here. This is about Alexander," right? That's not what they say. What they say is, "Yeah, there's a problem. Ezekiel was supposed to, or Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to do this, and he didn't. So how do we explain that?" Well, theologically, we can use something like Nineveh, right, and Jonah, or we can say, maybe it is that there's this other thing that God was doing behind the scenes that we don't know about. In other words, it's not something that's going directly against any of the data points. It's taking them into account and just saying, there's something that God is doing that we're just not told about in the text. And I think they feel comfortable doing that for reasons like it wasn't taken out of Ezekiel. And so they can rationalize, well, if it had been something that would have, caused him to be a false prophet, well, they would have taken it out or it wouldn't be there or whatever. So, so then to answer your question about how to, how to gear up, I guess, I have been incredibly fortunate to be able to. I mean, I think I spent a total of 15 years in grad school with my 2 degrees. I'm incredibly fortunate to have that opportunity, to have had that opportunity. And the nice thing about what Megan and my wife and I, what we do now, is we're not in academic research positions, so we're not having to come up with groundbreaking research topics and stay, um, the sharp edge of the knife or anything, coming up with these new theories. And no, we're not doing that. We're in a position where we can say, let us bring you all of those researchers that are doing this cutting edge research. Let's bring them on our channel and have them tell you about the research that they're doing. And at the same time, we can take their arguments and all the stuff all the foundational stuff, it's probably a good way to say it, that anybody that gets a PhD in Hebrew Bible knows about the documentary hypothesis, for example, knows about at least the basics about the formation of the Pentateuch. And so it's not really, the basics of that are not really debated. So what I decided I was going to do was try to put a resource together, or a series of resources together that sort of become a one-stop shop for different topics. So this book is volume 1 of a 2-volume set that's planned for now. And it has a whole chapter on like the background of the Old Testament story, what's the narrative itself. It has a chapter on the history of the ancient Near East. It has a chapter on archaeology and how it works and what biblical archaeology is. And does biblical archaeology actually prove the Bible? No. But then it has 4 chapters that are specific topics of contention that are meant to be the one-stop shop if you want to debate it. So there's a chapter on the dating of the book of Daniel, and everything in there that I think you need to know to debate the dating of the book of Daniel is in there. Everything about the Ezekiel prophecy against Tyre is in there. Everything that you need to know to show that Moses isn't the single author of the Pentateuch is in there. There's a whole chapter on that. And then there's a chapter on slavery in the Bible, going into the New Testament as well. And so that's, if there's I mean, that's a little self-serving, I agree. But I think that if an atheist or a skeptic is looking for a place to start, the book is probably a good place for 2 reasons. One, it's written for specifically that purpose. But 2, it has an extensive bibliography and tons and tons and tons of citations from scholars. So, So like I'm working right now on the Exodus chapter for the next volume. There's going to be a chapter on the Exodus and one on the conquest and the archaeology behind that and all that stuff. If you're into the Exodus, when that book comes out, you'll be able to read that chapter and know all the major players, who's arguing what, where you can go read about them, what their arguments are, and what I think are the strong and weak points of them. So that was
So
really long.
when's that book coming out? Did you say next month?
This one is on pre-order now. The Kindle version's on pre-order, and then it comes out in hard copy. Both the hard copy and the Kindle are released on the 28th. So 10 days or whatever from now.
Oh,
so
lovely. I think I'll be buying a copy.
We tried to price it. Megan tried to price it in a way that would be fair to everybody. So the hardcover, it's like a 430 page book, so it's pretty meaty. So it's $34.99 for the hardcover, but then the Kindle is $10. So if people can only afford $10, at least you get it and you can search it and all that stuff. So,
that's brilliant.
You know what I appreciate about that is I think this, again, just being my perspective. So when I heard that this was the topic, my ears just perked up, because something that actually led to me really embracing atheism and skepticism was doing research that included that prophecy. And I agree with what you'd said previously. It's kind of hard to find in the Bible something quite as uniquely telling when it comes to prophecy as what Ezekiel does. Poor guy. And I think when it comes to the research and the facts, it's hard. Like, this is a separate topic, but the fall of Jerusalem and the timing of that, the dating, it was challenging for me to find all of that information. So to hear that in your book, it's going to take all of that information that comes as, the culmination of years and years of work, and allows it to, or puts it in a format that allows people to not only sort of trace the lines and be able to, use the same tools and corroborate those tools, but then build on it. That those are like building blocks. I really appreciate that. And I think it's something that we need more in that community, because the way that my mind works as I think about this, there's a cascade effect when you make decisions without all the right information. And what you mentioned about, some apologists, Christian apologists, that you've come into contact with, that they don't have all the tools. They don't know that they don't have all the tools. So having that zeal for truth and fact and knowledge, I think is important. In lieu of that, really all we have is conjecture and opinion, isn't it? So I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I'm certainly going to be getting that book and utilizing it.
Yeah, I hope. I think about it, Jehovah's Witness. I don't have a lot of experience with it, but 607 is like a really important date, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't know exactly why it's really important. Is it because the 70 years captivity is supposed to?
It's to do with a prophecy in Daniel, and then they link it to a prophecy in Revelation, which then brings them and they do the chronological. They marry the two up, and they chronologically bring the beginning of the Great Tribulation to 1914. Am I correct there, Jared?
The last days, yeah. So a really quick rundown. If you, it's a lot of if you believe, right? But for them saying that Jerusalem was conquered in 607, then they. Exactly. And then they count from that, doing it, like Katie said, the 7 times prophecy in Daniel. They say that comes out to 2,520 years. And if you count forward in time Yeah, I know. From 607, if you count forward 2520, we get to 1914 of the Common Era, which they say was the beginning of the last days. The part Katie mentioned from Revelation is saying, so down the great dragon was hurled, and that would be the start of the last days. And so they say World War One, beginning in 1914, was that sign. And then, of course, they add in all this other stuff. And what I'd mentioned, not to detract too much from what you're about to say, but what I mentioned about it was hard to do research is by luck I chanced upon a cuneiform tablet that showed the lunar eclipses from in Nebuchadnezzar's reign that you can corroborate with NASA charts to show there's just no way in the world that 607 is the right answer. But anyway, yes, that's why it's relevant to them. Without that, because of how it fits into their doctrine and what they think of themselves as the chosen people of God, it just all falls apart.
Yeah, it's so tough. And it's not just people that don't have PhDs, right? It's like, for me, it's fields that I don't have a PhD in, right? Fields that I don't have training in. It's really hard for me to know, for example, a really good example of this. Jim Majors and I just did a debate on the dating of the book of Daniel. And again, Jim wrote his dissertation on Daniel. So he's like far more qualified to talk about it than I am. And so I felt like I was just there for moral support for him. But, I was all prepared to talk about the evidence from Daniel itself, right? Because that, from a historian standpoint, you look at things like, okay, well, we have contemporary documents, right? We have, for example, from the reign of Nabonidus, who was the king when the Neo-Babylonian Empire fell, to Cyrus. He's the guy that's ruling. We have a fair amount of documentation, administrative texts, and we have inscriptions and administrative texts, all kinds of stuff. And so, looking at those documents, looking at the stuff that's in Akkadian, or looking at what we see from inside of Daniel itself and how that stuff matches up, and so on and so forth. But the whole debate essentially focused on like Josephus, right? And first century historian. And it was like, well, I'm not a Greco-Roman specialist. I'm not a classicist. I don't work with the Greek and Roman historians. So when that was all over, I wanted to, in all my spare time, I wanted to do a little bit of reading about it and just see what other scholars were saying about some of the stuff that Josephus says specifically. But knowing who's reputable is tough. So, I'm having to go, just like anybody else, I'm having to go to classicists on Twitter or, those that I know, and say, hey, who would you read on this? So I don't think anybody should ever feel like, oh my gosh, I have to ask an expert. I think if you don't, and if you're listening and you don't think I need to ask an expert who I should read, or where to turn, who are the reputable sources on this, if you don't think that, there's a problem. And I see that problem a lot. There are a lot of apologists that I come into contact with, and I hate to say it this way, but I mean, you've heard it before. They know just enough to be dangerous. And that's true in this regard, because they'll read a particular scholar or two, and they may or may not realize that scholar, while a lot of what they write is pretty good on mainstream topics, on this thing that's highly contentious, they're fringe. That's just it. They're fringe on this, and they've been critiqued heavily in reviews and the secondary literature. But if you don't know how to look for that stuff, or if you don't have the access to it, you can read that and go, oh my gosh, it's in this reputable series, or the guy graduated from Cambridge or something. So it's got to be, he's got to know what he's talking about. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. And so, anyway, this is why, even though I feel I know a reasonable amount about the documentary hypothesis and the formation of the Pentateuch, like, there's no way on earth I'm writing on that without running that by Joel Baden. Not going to happen, right? I'm going to send that off to him. And in fact, he is responsible for a lot of the corrections, even in the chapter that I wrote, because that's what he does, right? He's a documentary hypothesis specialist up at Yale. So I think we're all in a position where if we're not leaning on experts in the field, there's a problem. I think there's a problem.
It's something that I see Jehovah's Witnesses doing a lot as well, is like they go about finding out the answers to things all the wrong way. They're not asking, well, what is the consensus on this? They're looking around all the information and looking for the answer which speaks to their doctrine, which speaks to their predefined answer that they already have. And then using that as proof, which is just the wrong way to go about anything within academia.
Lester Grabe out at Hull, he has this. It's buried in an edited volume in like 1987, but he has this brilliant article where he's talking about something with respect to the dating of the Book of Daniel, but it's about fundamentalism, and he has this quote, and I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but he basically says, fundamentalism is not looking because it already has the answer. And that's really the long and short of it. And you can see it time and again in these discussions. If you start with the idea that the Exodus account as described in the Hebrew Bible is historically reliable, in some way it has to be historically reliable. I mean, I don't know, where do you go from there, right? The only place that you go from there is to, okay, let's see, it's if I start with the Spider-Man story and I think, well, the Spider-Man story has to be historically reliable. It's part of the inspired Marvel? Is that Marvel? I don't know what it is. That's terrible.
Yeah, I don't want to say either way because I could get a lot of hate if I get that wrong.
See, I'm just dumb, so I can get that wrong. But, it's inspired. Well, then all you got to do is, well, it's in New York, and look, there's a newsstand over there, and there could be one in New York. Actually, that's a corner that in the past they've had newsstands on that corner, so that fits. And that building over there, actually, during that period, that building may have been there. So, you have these things that line up, and so it's possible, and it makes sense. And of course, since we know that it's true, and this is just evidence of that it's true. And you can't do it that way.
Count the misses, count the hits and ignore the misses, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I can't start with the Epic of Gilgamesh is historically accurate, right? I can't start with that. Because if I do, one thing that I can guarantee you is I can prove that Gilgamesh, I can get you lots of information that Uruk is a real place and that Gilgamesh was a real guy at Uruk. He was a real king at Uruk. And I can rattle off the top of my head all kinds of things that will fit with the Epic of Gilgamesh, all kinds of historical realities and customs. And, that doesn't mean that he was really a semi-divine giant, right? That went to the cedar forest and killed Humbaba. I guess it doesn't work that way. So yeah, I agree. It's problematic.
Yeah, definitely. I think before we end up, there was there it was from Jim Majors, and I love this comment. He's phrased it as a question in Ezekiel 26 verse 3. Yahweh says He's against Tyre. Is 250 years a reasonable amount of time for an all-powerful deity to be able to take out a city. I just love that comment.
So true. But he's playing the long game, Jim. He's playing the long game. You know, I mean, you gotta think of it as a lot of terror that must have been involved in that.
Plenty of time to repent.
Right, that's really what it is. But isn't that the case? I mean, this is the problem that I have with these sort of theological interpretations. Not that they're not possible, right? And that's one thing that I do want to make clear. You could get this book and you could learn all the arguments and you could bring them to an apologist, because I've done it time and again, and I guarantee you at the end of the conversation, they're going to walk away not believing you, right? It happens over and over again. And the reason is history is not set up like a deductive proof, right? You can't say X and then Y and therefore Z, and it's done. It's deductively proven. It's not going to happen. Because you can always say, well, isn't it possible that? And as long as you can say, isn't it possible that, with certain people, the way that they're arguing and the presuppositions that they have, that's always going to be enough. A great example of this, I think, is in that dating of the Book of Daniel debate.
Yeah.
There's a problem in the text where Nebuchadnezzar is said to be the father of Belshazzar, right? And you bring that up, and immediately the response is, well, wait a minute now. In Hebrew, the word father can mean grandfather. It doesn't have to mean father. And you go, yeah, but he wasn't his grandfather either. You go, well, that shows how much you know, because you see, it's possible that Nebuchadnezzar had a daughter that Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, married, and then he would be his grandfather. You say, yeah, I guess that's possible. Do you have any evidence for that? Well, no.
Yeah, so
But the text says, that he's his father, and which could be grandfather, and it's possible that he married a daughter, because Neriglissar, this other Neo-Babylonian king, married one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, and so why couldn't Nabonidus? Okay, I mean, I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
At that point, it's like,
the
there's no
the
person.
answer.
Yeah, I mean, there's no person Darius the Mede, right? Not only is there no evidence of a person named Darius the Mede to rule over Babylon, but we know who was ruling when he was supposed to have ruled. But isn't it possible that we'll find more information later? That's possible. That's possible. But I mean, if that's what we're going on,
you've always got to ask. If someone's saying, "Well, is it possible?" You've always got to ask, "Well, is it probable?"
Exactly.
So, you can't just leave it at, "Is it possible?" I used to get caught up in that when I first left Jehovah's Witnesses. I got caught up in the whole UFO, ufology crowd, and ancient aliens and all of that stuff, and that's always where they leave it at. Well, is it possible that there's an alien civilization living underneath the ice of Antarctica? Well, I suppose maybe you could spin it that way, but is it probable? No.
You know what I've struggled with as I started doing my own research and trying to tackle the things that I had learned over the years, and recognizing they weren't based on anything tangible, is you'll find people that really try to tear at the fabric of reality to make their arguments. And it usually starts with this, isn't it possible? And when in their minds nothing is impossible, when in fact part of that doctrine is with God all things are possible, how do you dismantle that? And I appreciate how you spoke to that. And it's just so interesting, because I know we're short on time, so I won't hog up too much of what's left, but what goes through my mind is how I mentioned that cascade effect a few minutes ago. people make decisions because of what they believe, and those decisions can sometimes negatively impact others. And so it's not as though every single belief system is benign, and just as long as they believe it, it doesn't impact anyone else. And of course, Katie, you know that our stories, as an example, and not being able to stay in contact with friends or family because of the decisions they've made, their belief system, and then also, what we've done for our belief system. It's just hard to imagine that there's no way to reverse that. And I wonder if perhaps, speaking more for myself than anyone else, although there are others I think of with this, part of the reason we're so eager to find these facts and find these truths is to reverse the effects of the belief systems. While at the same time, even if there's an ulterior motive, it takes no strength out of the need to find truth. And I just simply think that if we all did that, perhaps the negative effects of belief systems would be severely limited, because we'd all be working with what we can prove, and not so many of these things that are simply based on conjecture. But I'm really grateful that you broke it down the way you did, Dr. Bowen, and being able to have some tangible things, and also the humility of being able to say, well, that's not specifically my field. If only some of the people I know would be so quick to take themselves out of that conversation.
See, if you have a PhD advisor that will just absolutely destroy you if you say something that's wrong, then everybody has that humility instantly. So it's fear. It's fear. Oh gosh.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, Dr. Bowen. That's
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Been a fantastic conversation once again. I'd love to get you back on again sometime, to have further discussions. Obviously, I understand that your time is going to be quite quite scarce in the coming couple of months. So,
Yep. Twins are coming.
Congratulations.
Thank you. There will be 5 children in this house.
Wow.
Oof, 5 children.
I just got tired saying that. Man.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you once again, Dr. Josh, and thank you, Jared, for coming on and helping out tonight. And thank you for everyone in the chat. It's been a great conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it yourselves. And as always, please remember, ignorance is never bliss. Thank you, and good night.